The birdsong was the cruelest part. Private Thomas Brabourne crouched behind a crumbling stone wall near the village of Authie and listened to larks singing over the Normandy fields. The morning sun warmed his face. Apple orchards stretched across gentle hills. Wheat fields rippled gold in the breeze. It was the kind of summer morning that made a man want to lie down in the grass and sleep for 100 years. It was June 7th, 1944, and Thomas was about to learn that beauty meant nothing in war, that he was 20 years old, a fisherman's son from Pictou County, Nova Scotia. Yesterday, he had crossed the English Channel and stormed Juno Beach with the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. Yesterday, he had seen men die for the first time. Yesterday, he had killed his first German soldier, a boy who looked younger than his kid brother. The memory sat like a stone in his chest. But there was no time for grief. The orders were clear. Push south toward Carpiquet Airfield. Link up with the British. Secure the road to Cannes. The Canadians advanced through the countryside in high spirits. They had survived D-Day. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall. The Germans were retreating. Victory seemed close enough to taste. Thomas marched alongside William Chicken, a farm boy from Saskatchewan who talked constantly about the apple orchard he planned to plant when he got home. William was 19, freckled, and so skinny his uniform hung loose on his frame. He had lied about his age to enlist. He wanted to see the world before settling down to marry his sweetheart back in Rosetown. They did not know that Kurt Meyer was watching them. From the tower of the ancient Abbaye d'Ardenne, the SS commander tracked the Canadian column through his binoculars. Meyer was 33 years old, a veteran of Poland, the Netherlands, Greece, and the Eastern Front. He had earned the Knight's Cross for bravery. He had also earned a reputation for brutality. On the Eastern Front, his men had executed civilians and prisoners without hesitation. Now he commanded the 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the infamous Hitlerjugend. The division was Germany's youngest and most fanatical. Its soldiers were former Hitler youth, teenagers who had been raised since childhood on Nazi ideology. Most were 17 or 18 years old. They believed in final victory with religious fervor. They believed prisoners were a burden. They believed mercy was weakness. Their officers had taught them well. The trap was perfect. German tanks waited in hidden positions along the hedgerows. When the lead Sherman tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers rolled into the kill zone, anti-tank guns opened fire from 3 directions. The first Sherman exploded in a column of black smoke. The second slewed sideways and burst into flames. Crewmen scrambled from hatches with their uniforms on fire. Machine guns cut them down before they could run 10 steps. Thomas threw himself into a ditch as bullets snapped overhead. The peaceful morning dissolved into chaos. Mortars crashed among the wheat. Men screamed. The rattle of MG 42 machine guns filled the air with a sound like tearing canvas. Thomas fired his Lee Enfield at shadows in the hedgerows, but he could not see the enemy. He could only see his friends falling. The battle lasted 4 hours. The Canadians fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. By mid-afternoon, ammunition ran low. Officers were dead or wounded. Small groups of survivors tried to withdraw, but German tanks cut off every escape route. When the firing finally stopped, 47 Canadians stood with their hands raised in surrender. Thomas expected anger from his captors. He expected roughness, perhaps a beating. What he saw instead frightened him more. The young SS soldiers looked at the prisoners with empty eyes. They did not see men. They saw something less than human. One guard, a blond boy no older than 16, spat at William's feet and muttered something in German. Another guard laughed coldly. The prisoners were formed into a column and marched through the fields. French farmers watched from doorways with horror in their eyes. An old woman crossed herself and wept. Thomas did not understand why. He was a prisoner now. The fighting was over. He would spend the rest of the war in a camp, uncomfortable but alive. That was how it worked. That was what the Geneva Convention promised. Then the column turned. They were not heading east toward Germany. They were heading north, toward the ancient stone towers of the Abbaye d'Ardenne. Thomas looked at William. The farm boy's face had gone pale. He understood something terrible was coming. They all did. The birdsong had stopped. The abbey rose against the evening sky like a tomb. Its medieval walls had stood for 800 years, sheltering monks who grew herbs in quiet gardens and copied scriptures by candlelight. Now swastika flags hung from its windows. German half-tracks crowded its courtyard. And in a narrow stone passageway that led to those ancient gardens, 12 Canadian soldiers waited to die. Thomas pressed his back against the cold wall and tried to control his breathing. His hands trembled. Beside him, William whispered the Lord's Prayer under his breath, the words tumbling out fast and desperate. Down the passageway, a heavy wooden door opened and closed. Each time it opened, guard called out a name. Each time it closed, a prisoner walked through and did not return. Through a gap in the stones, Thomas could see into the abbey's main hall. German officers sat around a long table, eating bread and cheese, drinking wine from bottles looted from French cellars. They laughed at jokes. They studied maps. They conducted the business of war with casual efficiency while men were murdered 50 feet away. The disconnect was monstrous. It was ordinary. That was the worst part, that a Polish soldier stood guard near the passageway entrance. His name was Jan Jezianek, though Thomas did not know this yet. Jezianek had been conscripted into the German army against his will, a foreign worker forced to wear the uniform of his country's conquerors. He watched the prisoners with troubled eyes. He saw everything. He would remember everything. Years later, his testimony would send Kurt Meyer to prison. Inside the abbey, Meyer received a report. 7 more prisoners had arrived from the fighting near Buron, and 8 asked what should be done with them. According to witnesses who survived, Meyer's response was cold and practical. What should we do with these prisoners? They only eat up our rations. He turned to an officer and spoke quietly. Then, louder for all to hear, in the future, no more prisoners are to be taken. The order spread through the abbey like poison. Guards who had shown indifference now showed something worse. They moved with purpose. They checked their pistols. They avoided looking at the men they were about to kill. Thomas heard the shots. They came in irregular intervals, muffled by stone walls, but unmistakable. A single crack. Silence. Another crack. Silence. Sometimes 2 shots in quick succession. The guards were efficient. They were thorough. They had done this before on the Eastern Front, where the rules of war meant nothing and prisoners were obstacles to be eliminated. William gripped Thomas's arm so hard it left bruises. "We have to run," he breathed. "Tommy, we have to. There's nowhere to go." Thomas's voice was flat. He had already calculated the angles. Guards at both ends of the passageway. More guards in the courtyard. Tanks blocking the road. Even if they broke free, where would they run? The German lines stretched for miles in every direction that a guard appeared at the passageway entrance. He called a name. Private Robert McKeel, a young soldier from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, stood up slowly. His face was gray. His legs shook. He looked back at the other prisoners, and Thomas saw something in his eyes that he would never forget. Not fear, but sorrow. Sorrow for the life he would never live. Sorrow for the letters he would never write. Sorrow for a world that could allow such things to happen. McKeel walked through the door. It closed behind him. A shot rang out. Then silence. The pattern continued through the night. Name by name, man by man, the prisoners disappeared. Thomas learned their names as they were called. Harold Angel, Cecil Chicken, James Cruikshank, boys from Nova Scotia and Ontario and the Prairie Provinces. Boys who had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom. Boys who would never see home again. When William's name was called, the farm boy from Saskatchewan turned to Thomas one last time. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Tell my mother I wasn't scared," he said. "Tell her I thought about the apple trees." Then he was gone. Thomas sat alone in the darkness. He listened to his own heartbeat. He waited for his name to be called. He thought about his father's fishing boat, the smell of salt and cod, the cry of gulls over Pictou Harbor. He thought about the letter in his pocket, half-written, addressed to a girl named Margaret who worked at the general store. He would never finish it now. Then the British artillery came. Shells screamed overhead and crashed into the abbey grounds. Explosions shook the walls. Guards scattered. Chaos erupted. Thomas ran. He did not think. He did not plan. He simply moved, scrambling through smoke and falling stones, vaulting a low wall, sprinting across a moonlit field while bullets snapped past his head. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, and he collapsed in a drainage ditch a mile from the abbey. Behind him, the killing continued. 18 Canadians died at the Abbaye d'Ardenne that night. Their bodies would be found months later, buried in shallow graves in the garden where monks once grew rosemary and thyme. Thomas lay in the ditch until dawn. He did not weep. He was beyond tears. He simply stared at the stars and tried to understand how the world could contain such beauty and such horror at the same time, but he never found an answer. The wheat field stretched golden under the setting sun. It was the most beautiful place Harold Angel had ever seen. It was also where he was going to die. 0.5 days had passed since D-Day. The fighting around Puto and Besson had been savage, house-to-house combat through narrow village streets. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifles held their ground against repeated SS counterattacks until ammunition ran out and German tanks finally broke through. Now 40 Canadian prisoners stood in a field near Fresnel, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Harold was 22, a butcher's apprentice from Winnipeg who had enlisted on his 19th birthday. He had survived 3 days of brutal combat. He had watched friends die in burning tanks and crumbling farmhouses. He had killed German soldiers in hand-to-hand fighting so close he could smell their breath. None of it had prepared him for this. The SS guards formed a line 30 yards away. They moved with mechanical precision, spacing themselves evenly, checking their weapons. Their faces showed nothing. They might have been preparing for a drill exercise. They might have been lining up for morning inspection. They had done this before. The Eastern Front had taught them that killing prisoners was simply logistics. Wilhelm Mohnke had given the order. The commander of the 26th SS Panzer Grenadiers was a true believer, a Nazi since 1931 who had risen through the ranks by demonstrating absolute loyalty and absolute ruthlessness. He would never face trial for what happened in this field. He would live until 2001, dying peacefully in Hamburg at the age of 90. History would not touch him. Sergeant James Chicken stood in the front row of prisoners. He was William's older brother, though he did not yet know that William was already dead, buried in a shallow grave at the Abbaye d'Ardenne. James had watched the guards form their line. He had seen the configuration. He understood what was about to happen with the tactical clarity of a veteran soldier. "Listen to me," he said quietly, his voice carrying to the men behind him. "Whoever is left after they fire the first round, go to the left. Run north. Don't stop. Don't look back." The men tensed. Some prayed. Some wept. Some simply stared at the golden wheat and tried to memorize its beauty, knowing it would be the last thing they ever saw as a German officer walked forward. He was young, barely older than the prisoners, with pale eyes and a thin smile. He spoke in accented English, each word precise and deliberate. "Now you die." The guns roared. The first row fell. Bodies twisted and crumpled like puppets with cut strings. Blood sprayed across the wheat. Men screamed, some from wounds, some from pure animal terror. The second volley came before anyone could run. More bodies fell. Harold dove to the ground as bullets snapped overhead. He landed on something soft and warm. A body. Private Chicken. The sergeant had taken 3 rounds to the chest. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, already empty. Harold pressed himself flat. He felt blood soaking through his uniform, hot and thick, pooling beneath him. Some of it was his. A bullet had grazed his shoulder. Most of it belonged to the dead and dying men who covered him like a terrible blanket. The shooting stopped. Silence fell over the field, broken only by groans and whimpers from the wounded. Then footsteps. The Germans walked among the fallen, checking bodies, firing single shots into anyone who moved. Harold heard the crack of pistols, each one marking another death, each one moving closer, that he stopped breathing. He closed his eyes. He lay perfectly still beneath the weight of dead men who had been his friends, his brothers, his family for 3 years of war. He felt a boot nudge the body on top of him. He felt the vibration of footsteps passing by. He waited for the bullet that would end everything. WWII never came. The Germans finished their work and withdrew. Trucks rumbled away. Voices faded. The field fell silent. Harold did not move. He lay in the blood-soaked wheat until full darkness came, until the stars appeared, until he was certain the killers were gone. Then he crawled. He dragged himself through the field on his belly, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Moving inch by inch toward the distant tree line, it took hours. His wounded shoulder screamed with every movement. Twice he passed out and woke to find himself still crawling, his body moving on pure instinct. He thought of his mother. He thought of his sisters. He thought of the small apartment above the butcher shop where he had learned to cut meat and sweep floors and dream of a life beyond Winnipeg. He reached a farmhouse at dawn. A French woman named Marie found him collapsed in her garden, more dead than alive. She dragged him into her cellar. She bound his wounds with torn bedsheets. She hid him from German patrols for 3 weeks, risking her life and her children's lives for a stranger from across the ocean. When Canadian forces finally liberated the area, Harold led them to the field. 35 bodies lay where they had fallen, picked clean by crows, baked by the summer sun. 1 out of every 7 Canadians killed in Normandy during the first week had not died in combat. They had been executed after surrender. Harold Angel survived. He would carry the weight of that survival for the rest of his life. 40 Canadians faced German guns that evening. Only 5 escaped. The wheat grew back the next summer. The blood sank into the soil. The field returned to beauty. But the dead remained, waiting for justice that would never fully come. The courtroom was cold. December wind rattled the windows of the military tribunal in Aurich, Germany. Outside, snow fell on a ruined city. Inside, Thomas Brabourne sat in the witness gallery and watched the man who had ordered his friends' deaths. Kurt Meyer looked smaller than Thomas remembered. In the Abbey, he had seemed like a giant, a monster in black uniform with death in his eyes. Now he was just a man in a gray suit, his hair thinning, his face drawn. He sat straight-backed in the defendant's chair and stared ahead with the cold arrogance of someone who believed he had done nothing wrong. 18 months had passed since the killing at the Abbaye d'Ardenne. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The concentration camps had been opened, revealing horrors that made the world gasp. Nuremberg was putting Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity. And here, in this small courtroom, Canada sought justice for its murdered sons. The prosecution called witnesses. Jan Jezianek, the Polish soldier who had been forced to serve the SS, took the stand and described what he had seen. He repeated Meyer's words. "What should we do with these prisoners? They only eat up our rations." He described the parade of condemned men walking through the passageway to the garden. He identified where the bodies were buried. French civilians testified. Monique Level, daughter of the chateau's owner at Audru, described the massacre she witnessed from her bedroom window. She had counted the shots. She had counted the bodies. She had lived with the memory for 18 months, waiting for this moment. Canadian soldiers testified. Sergeant Stanley Dudka described being captured, watching German military police select 10 random prisoners for execution. Private Harold Angel described crawling through a field of corpses, playing dead, while Germans walked among the bodies, firing into anyone who moved. Thomas described the night at the Abbey, the shots in the darkness, William's last words about apple trees. Meyer denied everything. He claimed he knew nothing of the killings. He claimed his men acted without orders. He claimed he was a soldier, not a murderer, and that war was brutal and messy and that unfortunate things happened. He showed no remorse. He expressed no regret. He looked at the survivors with the same empty eyes Thomas remembered from the Abbey. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. On December 28, 1945, the verdict came, guilty of inciting his troops to deny quarter to the enemy. The sentence was death by firing squad. Thomas felt nothing. He had expected relief. He had expected satisfaction. Instead, he felt only emptiness. William was still dead. The apple trees would never be planted. 35 men still lay in a field near Fontenay. Justice could not resurrect the dead. It could only punish the living, and even that punishment felt hollow. 1 month later, the sentence was commuted. Major General Christopher Vokes could not find evidence of a direct written order. Without a signature on paper, he was reluctant to hang a soldier. Meyer's sentence became life imprisonment, that he served 5 years in a Canadian penitentiary in New Brunswick. He was transferred to a German prison in 1951. He was released in 1954 after serving less than 10 years for the murder of 156 men. Wilhelm Monk, who ordered the massacre at Fana-le-Pesnel, was captured by the Soviets and spent 10 years in Russian prisons. He was never tried for war crimes. He returned to Germany, sold cars for a living, and died peacefully in 2001 at the age of 90. Of the 5 SS officers recommended for prosecution, only Meyer ever faced justice. The others disappeared into post-war Germany, into new lives, into comfortable old age. The world moved on. The Cold War demanded new alliances. Former enemies became friends. Memory faded, but Thomas did not forget. He returned to Nova Scotia after the war. He married Margaret from the general store. He had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He became a fisherman like his father and spent his days on the water, where the rhythm of the waves helped quiet the ghosts. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, Thomas returned to Normandy. He walked through the Abbaye d'Ardenne with his eldest son. The garden was peaceful now. Birds sang in the apple trees. A memorial stone marked the place where 18 Canadians had died. Small maple leaf flags, left by Canadian pilgrims, fluttered in the breeze. The inscription read, "They are gone but not forgotten." Thomas stood for a long time. He thought about William, the farm boy who wanted to plant apple trees. He thought about the sound of birdsong on that last peaceful morning before the Panzers came. He thought about all the years that had passed, all the seasons that had turned, all the children who had grown up in a world those dead boys would never see. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I told your mother you weren't scared." The wind stirred the flags. The apple trees swayed. Somewhere in the branches, a lark began to sing. The world tried to forget what happened to those 156 Canadians. The trials were brief. The sentences were light. The guilty men lived long lives. But the names remain, carved in stone at Benny-sur-Mer, spoken at memorials every June, carried in the hearts of families who never stopped asking why. Some crimes are too terrible to forget. Some silences are too loud to ignore. In the gardens of Normandy, the dead still wait. History remembers.